The morning sun cast long shadows across the Henderson family farm in rural Nebraska, painting the wheat fields in shades of gold that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. It was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, where secrets were harder to keep than promises, and where the biggest excitement usually came from the county fair each September. But today was different. Today, 17-year-old Emma Henderson stood at her bedroom window, watching the school bus disappear down the gravel road, her heart heavy with a weight that had nothing to do with missing another day of classes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma had been homeschooled for the past 3 weeks, ever since the incident that left her with a broken wrist and bruises that had finally faded from purple to yellow-green. Her parents, Martha and Robert Henderson, believed their daughter when she said she'd fallen down the school stairs. They were good people, hardworking farmers who trusted their community and couldn't imagine that anyone would deliberately hurt their gentle, bookish daughter. But Emma knew the truth. She knew exactly how her wrist had gotten broken, and she knew it would happen again if she went back to school. The Henderson farm had been in the family for 4 generations, a sprawling 800-acre operation that produced some of the finest wheat and corn in the county. Martha ran a small but successful organic vegetable garden that supplied 3 local restaurants, while Robert managed the grain crops with the kind of quiet competence that came from decades of working the land. They'd raised 2 daughters on this farm, Emma, their gentle youngest, who preferred books to farm work, and Sarah, their eldest, who had left home at 18 to join the military. Sarah Henderson was a legend in their small town of Millbrook, population 2,847. She'd been the star athlete in high school, breaking records in track and field that still stood 10 years later. She'd been valedictorian, homecoming queen, and the kind of natural leader who made everyone around her want to be better. When she announced her intention to join the Navy after graduation, the whole town had turned out for her send-off party. That was 12 years ago, and while Sarah came home for Christmas and the occasional summer visit, most folks had lost track of what exactly she was doing in the military. Emma knew, though. She'd watched with pride as her sister climbed the ranks, earning her trident and becoming one of the few women to serve in the Naval Special Warfare community. Sarah was now Commander Sarah Henderson, and she led a team of elite warriors who specialized in the kind of missions that never made the news. But to Emma, she was still the big sister who used to read her bedtime stories and teach her how to throw a curveball. The bullying had started small, the way these things always do. It began with Madison Pierce, the 17-year-old daughter of Millbrook's wealthiest family, who seemed to take personal offense at Emma's quiet intelligence and her family's humble circumstances. Madison's father owned the largest car dealership in 3 counties, and her mother came from old money that traced back to the railroad barons of the 1800s. Madison herself was everything Emma was not: loud, confident, impeccably dressed, and surrounded by a circle of loyal followers who laughed at her jokes and echoed her opinions. At first, it was just snide comments about Emma's clothes, which were clean and well-maintained, but clearly not expensive. Then it escalated to accidentally bumping into Emma in the hallways, knocking her books from her hands, or finding ways to exclude her from group projects. Emma tried to handle it the way her parents had taught her, with grace, dignity, and the belief that people were fundamentally good if you gave them a chance. But Madison Pierce wasn't fundamentally good. She was a bully in the truest sense, someone who derived genuine pleasure from the pain and humiliation of others. She had identified Emma as an easy target: quiet, non-confrontational, and without the social connections that might have provided protection. Over the course of the fall semester, Madison's campaign against Emma had grown bolder and more vicious. The breaking point had come 3 weeks ago, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Emma had been walking to her locker after chemistry class when Madison and her 3 closest followers, Jessica, Brittany, and Chloe, had cornered her in an empty hallway near the gymnasium. What started as the usual verbal harassment quickly escalated when Emma, exhausted from months of torment, finally stood up for herself. "Why don't you just leave me alone?" Emma had said, her voice shaking but determined. "Do you know who I am? Do you know what my family could do to your pathetic little farm?"
Emma had tried to walk away, but Madison grabbed her arm, squeezing hard enough to leave fingerprint bruises. "I'm not done with you," Madison snarled. That's when Emma tried to pull free, and Madison shoved her backward with both hands. Emma's feet tangled, and she fell hard against the metal Edgewood trophy case, her left wrist taking the full impact with a sickening crack. The girls had scattered like startled birds, leaving Emma alone on the floor, cradling her broken wrist and fighting back tears. When the school nurse found her 20 minutes later, Emma told the same story she'd tell everyone else. She'd tripped and fallen down the stairs. The nurse, Mrs. Patterson, had given her a skeptical look, but hadn't pushed for details. Now, standing at her bedroom window 3 weeks later, Emma watched the school bus disappear and wondered how much longer she could keep living this way. Her wrist was healing, but her spirit felt more broken with each passing day. She'd tried to convince her parents to let her finish her senior year through online classes, but they were worried about her isolation. They wanted her to go back to school, to face whatever had made her so afraid, but they didn't understand what she was really facing. Martha Henderson knocked softly on Emma's door before entering with a cup of coffee, and that gentle smile that had comforted Emma through childhood nightmares and teenage heartbreaks. "How are you feeling this morning, sweetheart?" she asked, setting the coffee on Emma's nightstand. "I'm fine, Mom," Emma replied automatically, the lie coming easily after weeks of practice. Martha studied her daughter's face with the keen insight that came from 24 years of motherhood. Emma looked tired, older than her 17 years, and there was a sadness in her eyes that no amount of rest seemed to cure. "You know you can tell me anything, don't you?" Martha said softly. "Your father and I were worried about you." Emma forced a smile. "I know, Mom. I'm just tired. Maybe I'm coming down with something." It wasn't entirely a lie. Emma was tired, bone-deep exhausted from the constant fear and stress. She was tired of looking over her shoulder, tired of making excuses, tired of feeling like a prisoner in her own life. But she couldn't bring herself to tell her parents the truth. They'd want to get involved, to talk to the school administration or Madison's parents, and that would only make things worse. Madison had made it clear that any attempt to get adults involved would result in severe consequences, not just for Emma, but potentially for her family's farm. The Pierce family wielded considerable influence in Millbrook and the surrounding county. Madison's father, Richard Pierce, sat on the school board, the town council, and the board of directors for the local bank that held the mortgage on several family farms, including the Hendersons. Madison's mother, Victoria, chaired the county zoning commission and had connections throughout the state government. They were the kind of people who could make life very difficult for a family like the Hendersons if they chose to do so. Emma understood the power dynamics at play, even if she couldn't articulate them fully. She knew that her family's quiet dignity and honest work ethic were no match for the Pierce family's wealth and connections. So she kept her silence, even as it ate away at her from the inside. What Emma didn't know was that her silence was about to be broken, not by her own choice, but by the arrival of someone who had never learned to back down from a fight. Someone who had spent the last 12 years learning exactly how to handle bullies who thought they were untouchable. Commander Sarah Henderson was coming home.
The C-130 Hercules transport plane touched down at Offutt Air Force Base outside Omaha with the practiced precision that marked all military operations. Commander Sarah Henderson gathered her gear with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to rapid deployments and quick transitions. She'd been in the middle of a training exercise at Naval Special Warfare Development Group headquarters in Virginia Beach when she received the emergency leave approval. Officially, she was taking 2 weeks of personal leave to visit family, Unofficially, she was responding to a gut instinct that something was seriously wrong at home. Sarah had tried calling Emma 3 times over the past month, but each conversation had felt stilted and strange. Her little sister, normally chatty and eager to share every detail of her life, had become monosyllabic and evasive. When Sarah asked about school, Emma's responses were vague. When she asked about friends, Emma changed the subject. Most telling of all, when Sarah asked if everything was okay, Emma's "fine" came too quickly and with too much emphasis. Sarah Henderson hadn't survived 12 years in naval special operations by ignoring her instincts. She'd learned to trust the small voice that whispered warnings when something wasn't right, whether it was the placement of a suspicious package in a Baghdad marketplace or the tone of her sister's voice during a phone call from Nebraska. That voice was screaming now, and Sarah had learned long ago to listen when it spoke. The drive from Omaha to Millbrook took 3 hours, giving Sarah plenty of time to think. She'd rented a nondescript sedan rather than the motorcycle she preferred, wanting to keep a low profile for now. As the urban landscape gave way to endless fields of corn and wheat, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of peace and restlessness that always accompanied her return to Nebraska. This was home, the place that had shaped her into the person she'd become, but it was also the place she'd needed to leave in order to discover who she really was. Sarah had known from a young age that she was different from other girls in Millbrook. While her classmates dreamed of marriage and babies, Sarah dreamed of adventure and challenge. She'd excelled at every sport she tried. But it wasn't the competition that drew her. It was the chance to push her limits, to discover what she was truly capable of. The military had provided the perfect outlet for those drives, and naval special operations had given her a purpose that went beyond personal achievement. In 12 years of service, Sarah had been deployed to 17 countries across 4 continents. She'd led rescue missions in hostile territory, conducted reconnaissance operations in denied areas, and trained foreign military units in counter-terrorism tactics. She'd earned the respect of her peers, the loyalty of her subordinates, and the fear of her enemies. At 30, she was the youngest female commander in naval special warfare, and her personnel file was thick with commendations, medals, and classified mission reports that would never see the light of day. But none of that mattered right now. Right now, she was just a big sister with a growing suspicion that someone had hurt the person she loved most in the world. Sarah had always been protective of Emma, even when they were children. The 8-year age gap had made Sarah more of a second mother than a traditional sibling, and she'd taken that responsibility seriously. She remembered teaching 5-year-old Emma how to ride a bike, running alongside her with one hand on the seat until Emma found her balance and pedaled away with laughter of pure joy. She remembered helping Emma with homework, reading to her when she was sick, and defending her from the occasional playground bully who thought a quiet, bookish girl was an easy target. Those memories made Sarah's jaw clench as she navigated the familiar roads toward home. If someone was hurting Emma, if someone thought they could target her sister without consequences, they were about to learn a very painful lesson about the Henderson family. The Henderson farm came into view as Sarah crested the hill on County Road 47, and she felt her heart lift despite her concerns. The white farmhouse with its wraparound porch looked exactly the same, down to the swing that still hung from the old oak tree in the front yard. The red barn was freshly painted, and the fields stretched green and healthy toward the horizon. It was a picture of American agricultural prosperity, the kind of place that represented everything good about rural America. Sarah pulled into the gravel driveway and sat for a moment, gathering her thoughts. She'd rented a nondescript sedan rather than the motorcycle she'd preferred, wanting to keep a low profile for now. Through the living room window, she could see her mother moving around the kitchen, probably preparing lunch. There was no sign of Emma, which was unusual for a Thursday afternoon. Martha Henderson nearly dropped the plate she was washing when she saw her eldest daughter walking up the front porch steps. Sarah was dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, boots, and a simple black t-shirt, but she carried herself with the unmistakable bearing of a professional soldier. At 5'8", she was tall for a woman, but not unusually so. What made her remarkable was the way she moved, with the fluid confidence of someone completely comfortable in her own skin. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her green eyes, the same shade as Emma's, missed nothing as they swept the porch and the surrounding area. "Sarah!" Martha exclaimed, dropping the plate into the sink and rushing to embrace her daughter. "What are you doing here? Why didn't you call?" Sarah hugged her mother tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of vanilla and lavender that had meant home for as long as she could remember. "Surprise visit?" she said, stepping back to study her mother's face. "I had some leave time accumulated and I wanted to see everyone. Where's Emma? Shouldn't she be getting home from school about now?" The slight hesitation before her mother answered told Sarah everything she needed to know. "Emma's been homeschooling for a few weeks," Martha said, not quite meeting Sarah's eyes. "She had an accident at school, broke a wrist, and we thought it might be better for her to finish up her coursework from home." "What kind of accident?" Sarah asked, her voice carefully neutral. "She fell down some stairs," Martha replied, but her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by the explanation herself. "These things happen, you know. She's upstairs in her room, probably reading. She'll be so excited to see you." Sarah nodded, but her mind was already processing the information and finding it insufficient. Emma had always been graceful and sure-footed, not the type to fall down stairs. And if the injury had been serious enough to require weeks of homeschooling, there was more to the story than a simple accident. "I'll go surprise her," Sarah said, starting toward the stairs. "Actually," Martha said quickly, "maybe you should knock first. She's been, well, she hasn't been quite herself lately. A little jumpy, you know?" That stopped Sarah cold. Emma had never been jumpy. She'd been shy, certainly, and sometimes anxious about new situations, but never jumpy. Jumpy was what happened to people who'd learned to expect danger, who'd been hurt and were afraid of being hurt again. Sarah took the stairs 2 at a time, her military training automatically cataloging details that might be important. The house was clean and well-maintained, as always, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there during her previous visits. When she reached Emma's door, she could hear the faint sound of typing, probably homework or maybe one of the stories Emma liked to write in her spare time. Sarah knocked gently. "Emma? It's me." The typing stopped abruptly, followed by the sound of a chair scraping across the floor. "Sarah?" Emma's voice was uncertain, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Open up, kiddo. I missed you." The door opened slowly, and Sarah felt her heart clench at the sight of her sister. Emma looked thinner than she had during their video calls, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. Her left wrist was still wrapped in an elastic bandage, and she held it protectively against her body. But it was the look in Emma's eyes that hit Sarah hardest, a combination of wariness and exhaustion that no 17-year-old should ever have to carry. Emma launched herself into Sarah's arms with a sob that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her soul. "I'm so glad you're here," she whispered against Sarah's shoulder. "I've missed you so much." Sarah held her sister tightly, her mind already shifting into the analytical mode that had kept her alive through countless dangerous missions. Emma's reaction was too intense for a simple surprise visit. This was the response of someone who'd been carrying a heavy burden alone, someone who desperately needed help but didn't know how to ask for it. "Hey," Sarah said softly, pulling back to study Emma's face. "What's really going on here? And don't tell me you fell down some stairs. I know you better than that." Emma's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, Sarah thought she was going to tell her everything. But then her expression shuddered and she stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself defensively. "It was just an accident. I'm fine. Everything's fine." Sarah recognized the lie immediately. She'd heard variations of it from dozens of sources over the years. Frightened civilians, captured enemies, even fellow soldiers who were trying to protect information they thought was too dangerous to share. But hearing it from Emma, seeing the fear in Emma's eyes, ignited something cold and dangerous in Sarah's chest. Someone had hurt Emma. Someone had hurt her badly enough to break her wrist and her spirit. Someone had threatened her severely enough that she was willing to lie to the person she trusted most in the world rather than risk making the situation worse. That someone was about to discover that they'd made a very serious mistake.
That evening, the Henderson family gathered around the dinner table for the first time in months. Robert Henderson had come in from the fields with dirt still under his fingernails and the satisfied exhaustion that came from a day of honest work. Martha had prepared Sarah's favorite meal, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, fresh corn from their garden, and apple pie made from fruit picked from their own trees. It should have been a joyful reunion, but Sarah couldn't ignore the undercurrents of tension that ran through every interaction. Emma picked at her food, barely eating despite Martha's gentle encouragement. She kept her injured wrist in her lap throughout the meal and flinched slightly whenever someone spoke to her directly. Most telling of all, she asked no questions about Sarah's work or her recent deployments, topics that had always fascinated her in the past. Robert, for his part, seemed oblivious to the tension. He was genuinely happy to have Sarah home and spent most of the meal updating her on farm operations, crop yields, and local news. "The Millers sold their place to that big agricultural corporation out of Chicago," he mentioned between bites of pot roast. "Shame to see another family farm go, but I understand why they did it. Times are tough for everyone." "What about the Pierce family?" Sarah asked casually, watching Emma's reaction out of the corner of her eye. "Are they still the big shots in town?" Emma went rigid at the mention of the name, confirming Sarah's suspicions. Robert nodded, seemingly unaware of his younger daughter's reaction. "Oh, yes. Richard Pierce is more influential than ever. He's talking about running for county commissioner next year. That daughter of his is quite the student from what I hear. Honor roll, student council, all that." Sarah filed away the information while keeping her expression neutral. The Pierce name clearly meant something significant to Emma, something that triggered fear rather than admiration. She made a mental note to learn everything she could about the family and their daughter. After dinner, Sarah helped her mother clear the table while Emma disappeared upstairs, claiming she had homework to finish. Martha washed dishes with the same methodical care she applied to everything else, but Sarah could see the worry lines around her eyes. "Mom," Sarah said quietly, "how long has Emma really been having problems?" Martha's hand stilled in the soapy water. "What do you mean?" "She's scared of something. I can see it in the way she moves, the way she looks around before she speaks. That's not the result of falling downstairs." Martha dried her hands on her apron and turned to face her daughter. "I've been worried too. She's changed over the past few months. She used to be so excited about school, about her classes and her writing. Now she barely leaves her room. She says she fell, and the school backed up her story, but you don't believe it," Sarah finished. "I want to believe it. It would be so much easier if it was just an accident. But you're right. She's frightened of something, and I don't know what to do about it." Sarah squeezed her mother's shoulder. "Let me talk to her. Sometimes it's easier to tell things to someone who's not here every day." An hour later, Sarah knocked on Emma's door again. This time, she didn't wait for permission to enter. Emma was sitting at her desk, staring at a blank computer screen. Her homework lay untouched beside her keyboard. "Scoot over," Sarah said, settling herself on Emma's bed.
We need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," Emma replied automatically, but her voice lacked conviction. Sarah studied her sister's profile, noting the way Emma's shoulders hunched defensively. "Emma, I've spent the last 12 years learning to read people. It's literally part of my job to identify threats, assess situations, and protect people who need help. Right now, every instinct I have is telling me that you're in danger." Emma's hands trembled slightly as she turned to face Sarah. "You don't understand. It's complicated." "Try me. I've dealt with complicated situations before." For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the old clock on Emma's nightstand. Then, as if a dam had suddenly burst, the words came pouring out of Emma in a rush that was part confession, part plea for help. "It started at the beginning of the school year," Emma began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Madison Pierce decided she didn't like me. I don't even know why. At first, it was just mean comments, about my clothes, my family, the farm. I tried to ignore it, the way Mom and Dad taught me, but it just got worse." Sarah listened without interruption as Emma described months of escalating harassment. The verbal abuse had grown more vicious over time, targeting everything from Emma's appearance to her family's modest circumstances. Madison and her followers had made Emma's life at school a daily nightmare of humiliation and fear. "It got physical 3 weeks ago," Emma continued, tears streaming down her face. "Madison cornered me with her friends, and when I tried to stand up for myself, she pushed me. I fell against a trophy case and broke my wrist. But Sarah, that's not even the worst part." Emma pulled out her phone and showed Sarah a series of text messages that had been sent over the past 3 weeks. The messages were vicious, threatening not just Emma, but the entire Henderson family. Madison had made it clear that if Emma told anyone what really happened, there would be consequences that extended far beyond high school bullying.
"She said her family could destroy us," Emma whispered. "They could call in our loans, get Dad fired from his part-time job at the grain elevator, maybe even find ways to get our farm condemned. I couldn't risk it, Sarah. I couldn't risk our family losing everything because of me." Sarah read through the messages, her jaw tightening with each vicious word. These weren't the idle threats of a teenager throwing a tantrum. They were calculated, specific, and designed to terrorize Emma into silence. Worse, they showed a level of malicious sophistication that suggested Madison Pierce was a genuinely dangerous individual, someone who took pleasure in wielding power over others. "Emma," Sarah said carefully, "have you saved all of these messages?" Emma nodded. "I didn't know what else to do with them. I was afraid to delete them, but I was also afraid someone would see them." "You did the right thing by saving them. But Emma, you should have told someone. You should have told me." "I was scared," she sobbed. "I didn't want to make things worse. I thought maybe if I just stayed away from school, eventually Madison would get bored and find someone else to pick on." Sarah pulled her sister into her arms, feeling the familiar surge of protective fury that had driven her to excel in her military career. But this was different. This wasn't about protecting abstract strategic interests or foreign allies. This was about protecting Emma, the sweet, gentle girl who had been Sarah's motivation through every difficult mission and dangerous deployment. "Listen to me very carefully," Sarah said, her voice taking on the command authority that had led Marines and SEALs through combat operations across 3 theaters of war. "You are never going back to that school afraid. You are never going to let anyone make you feel like you have to hide or apologize for existing. And Madison Pierce is going to learn that there are consequences for targeting people who can't fight back." "But, Sarah, you don't understand the kind of influence her family has." "Emma,"
Sarah interrupted. "I've spent the last 12 years dealing with people who thought they were untouchable. Dictators, warlords, terrorist leaders, they all believed their power made them invincible. They were all wrong. Madison Pierce is just another bully who's never faced real consequences for her actions. That's about to change." Emma pulled back to look at her sister's face, and what she saw there made her breath catch. Sarah's expression was calm, almost serene, but her eyes held a cold intensity that Emma had never seen before. This was Commander Sarah Henderson, the warrior who had earned her reputation in the world's most dangerous places. "What are you going to do?" Emma asked. Sarah smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "I'm going to pay a visit to Millbrook High School tomorrow. It's time I met Madison Pierce and had a conversation about appropriate behavior and consequences. But first, I need you to do something for me. Anything. I need you to write down everything that's happened, starting from the very beginning. Every incident, every threat, every time Madison or her friends made you feel unsafe. Include dates if you remember them, names of witnesses, everything. Can you do that?" Emma nodded, already reaching for a notebook. "What are you going to do with it?" "I'm going to make sure that Madison Pierce understands she picked the wrong family to mess with. And then I'm going to make sure this never happens to anyone else." As Emma began writing, Sarah stepped out onto the porch and pulled out her phone. She had calls to make and information to gather. By tomorrow morning, she would know everything there was to know about Madison Pierce, her family, and their connections in Millbrook County. She would understand their weaknesses, their vulnerabilities, and their pressure points. Madison Pierce thought she was untouchable because her family had money and influence in a small Nebraska town. She was about to learn the difference between local power and the kind of authority that came from serving in the world's most elite military units. The war for Emma's dignity was about to begin, and Madison Pierce had no idea what she was up against.
Sarah Henderson had always been an early riser, but this morning she was up before dawn, her internal clock still adjusted to military time, despite being on leave. She sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, a cup of black coffee, and a determination that had been forged in some of the world's most dangerous places. Over the past 4 hours, she had conducted the kind of thorough intelligence gathering that had made her invaluable to Naval Special Operations Command. The information she'd compiled on Madison Pierce and her family was extensive and revealing. Richard Pierce's car dealership empire had been built on questionable business practices that skirted the edge of legality. 3 separate complaints had been filed with the Better Business Bureau over the past 5 years, all involving deceptive sales tactics targeting elderly or financially vulnerable customers. Victoria Pierce's family money came from a trust fund established by her grandfather, a railroad baron who had made his fortune through methods that would be considered criminal by today's standards. More importantly, Sarah had discovered that the Pierce family's influence was built on carefully maintained relationships and mutual backscratching, rather than genuine respect or legitimate authority. Richard Pierce's position on the school board had been secured through a combination of campaign donations and subtle threats to withdraw sponsorship from various school programs. Victoria's role on the zoning commission had been obtained after she'd arranged for certain environmental impact studies to disappear from public records. But the most useful information Sarah had found concerned Madison herself. The 17-year-old had a juvenile record that had been sealed through her family's connections, but Sarah's military contacts had access to databases that weren't available to civilian investigators. Madison had been arrested twice for assault, once for attacking a younger student at her previous private school, and once for hitting a restaurant server who had brought her the wrong order. Both incidents had been covered up with money and influence, but the records still exist for those who knew where to look. Sarah closed her laptop and checked the time. 7:30 a.m. Perfect. She had a plan, and it was time to put it into motion.
The drive to Millbrook High School took 20 minutes through the quiet morning streets. Sarah had chosen her outfit carefully. Dark jeans, combat boots, and a fitted black shirt that showed off the kind of physique that came from years of military fitness training. She wore no jewelry except for a simple watch, and her hair was pulled back in a professional ponytail. She looked exactly like what she was, a highly trained operator who was completely comfortable with violence when it was necessary. The school was a typical small-town facility, red brick and functional design, surrounded by well-maintained grounds and a parking lot full of pickup trucks and hand-me-down sedans. Sarah parked near the main entrance and walked through the front doors with the confident stride of someone who belonged wherever she chose to be. The main office was staffed by two middle-aged women who looked up with surprise when Sarah entered. Visitors were unusual at 7:45 in the morning, especially visitors who carried themselves with military bearing. "Can I help you?" asked the woman behind the main desk, whose nameplate identified her as Mrs. Gonzalez. "I'd like to speak with your principal about a student matter," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the crisp authority that came from years of giving orders that had to be followed without question. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Davidson usually doesn't see visitors without an appointment. If you'd like to schedule something for later in the week..." "I'm Commander Sarah Henderson, United States Navy. I'm here regarding my sister Emma Henderson, who has been a victim of assault and ongoing harassment by another student at this school. I need to speak with Mr. Davidson immediately." The title and the ID had their desired effect. Mrs. Gonzalez's expression shifted from polite dismissal to respectful attention. "Of course, Commander Henderson. Let me check if Mr. Davidson is available." While she waited, Sarah observed the office environment with the same attention to detail she applied to reconnaissance missions. The walls were covered with the usual school propaganda, motivational posters, academic achievement awards, and photographs of various student activities. But Sarah noticed what was missing: any visible anti-bullying policies, no posted procedures for reporting harassment, and no evidence that student safety was considered a priority. Principal Davidson emerged from his office looking harried and slightly intimidated. He was a thin man in his 50s, with the pale complexion of someone who spent too much time under fluorescent lights and the nervous energy of someone who was perpetually worried about keeping his job. "Now then," Davidson said, settling behind his desk, "what exactly can I do for you?" Sarah remained standing, using her height advantage to establish dominance in the conversation. "3 weeks ago, my sister Emma was assaulted by another student in your hallway. She suffered a broken wrist and has been too traumatized to return to school. I want to know what you're doing about it." Davidson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I'm not aware of any assault, Commander Henderson. According to our records, Emma had an accidental fall down some stairs. There was no mention of another student being involved." Sarah placed her phone on Davidson's desk and played one of the threatening voicemails Madison had left for Emma. The girl's voice was clear and unmistakable as she described exactly what would happen to Emma and her family if she ever told anyone the truth about what had happened. "This voicemail was left on my sister's phone the day after the accident," Sarah said, her voice deadly calm. "Would you like to explain to me how someone accidentally breaks a wrist falling downstairs and then receives detailed threats about keeping quiet?" Davidson's face went pale as he listened to the message. This is very concerning. But, Commander, you have to understand that accusations of this nature are very serious. We would need to investigate thoroughly before—" "Mr. Davidson," Sarah interrupted, leaning forward slightly. "Let me be very clear about something. My sister has been terrorized for months by Madison Pierce and her followers. She has been physically assaulted, verbally abused, and threatened with harm to her entire family. Either you address this situation immediately and effectively, or I will take this matter to the county sheriff, the state education department, and every media outlet within 500 miles. Davidson swallowed hard, clearly recognizing that he was dealing with someone who had both the authority and the connections to make good on her threats. What exactly are you asking me to do? I want Madison Pierce and her accomplices suspended pending a full investigation. I want written policies implemented to prevent this kind of harassment in the future. And I want assurance that my sister can return to school without fear of retaliation. Mr. Henderson, I understand your concerns, but the Pierce family has significant influence in this community. Richard Pierce is on our school board, and Sarah's expression hardened into something that would have been familiar to enemy combatants who had made the mistake of threatening her team. Are you telling me that you're more concerned about political pressure than about protecting your students? No, of course not, Davidson said quickly. But these are serious accusations, and we need to follow proper procedures. Sarah straightened to her full height and fixed Davidson with a stare that had made hardened Marines reconsider their life choices. Then let me help you understand the procedures you should be following. When a student is assaulted on school property, you are legally required to report it to law enforcement. When a student receives written threats, that constitutes harassment. When school administrators fail to protect students from known bullies, that creates liability for both the school district and the individual administrators. She paused to let that sink in before continuing. I have documentation of every incident, copies of every threatening message, and witness statements that prove Madison Pierce has been conducting a campaign of harassment against my sister for months. If you fail to take appropriate action, I will ensure that every one of these failures becomes a matter of public record. Davidson was sweating now, clearly calculating the potential consequences of various courses of action. What if we arranged for Madison to be transferred to independent study for the remainder of the semester? That would keep her separated from Emma without the need for formal suspension proceedings. Not good enough, Sarah replied immediately. Madison Pierce needs to face real consequences for her actions, not a slap on the wrist that she can spin as an extended vacation. Furthermore, her accomplices need to understand that participating in harassment has consequences too. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Mrs. Gonzalez entered with an expression of barely controlled panic. Mr. Davidson, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Richard Pierce is here. He says he needs to speak with you immediately about his daughter. Sarah smiled coldly. Perfect timing. Please ask Mr. Pierce to join us. Davidson looked like he wanted to crawl under his desk, but he nodded to Mrs. Gonzalez. Send him in. Richard Pierce entered the office with the bluster and confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and influence. He was tall and well-dressed, with silver hair and the kind of aggressive handshake that was meant to establish dominance. His confidence faltered slightly when he saw Sarah, but he recovered quickly. Davidson, what's this nonsense about my daughter being investigated for some kind of harassment? Madison is an honor student and a model citizen. I won't have her reputation damaged by false accusations from some jealous classmate. Sarah stepped forward before Davidson could respond. Mr. Pierce, I'm Commander Sarah Henderson, Emma Henderson's sister. Your daughter assaulted my sister and has been threatening her for weeks. We're here to discuss the consequences. Pierce's expression shifted from bluster to calculation as he sized up Sarah. He clearly recognized that she wasn't someone who could be easily intimidated, but his years of wielding local influence made him reluctant to back down completely.
Commander Henderson, he said, his tone shifting to false politeness, I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. Madison is a good girl who sometimes gets caught up in typical teenage drama. I'm confident we can work something out without involving formal disciplinary procedures. Sarah pulled out her phone again and played the same threatening voicemail she'd shared with Davidson.
Pierce's face darkened as he heard his daughter's voice describing exactly what she would do to Emma's family. "Does that sound like typical teenage drama to you, Mr. Pierce?" Sarah asked. Pierce was quiet for a long moment, clearly trying to calculate his options. Finally, he tried a different approach. "Look, Commander, I understand you're upset, but you need to consider the bigger picture here. My family has significant investments in this community. The Henderson farm, for instance. I believe your parents have their mortgage through our local bank. These things can be complicated." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah recognized it immediately, and her response was swift and decisive. She stepped closer to Pierce, invading his personal space in a way that made him instinctively step backward. "Mr. Pierce," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. I have spent the last 12 years dealing with people who thought they could threaten innocent civilians to get what they wanted. Some of them were dictators with armies. Some of them were terrorists with chemical weapons. Some of them were warlords who controlled entire regions. Do you know what they all had in common?" Pierce swallowed hard, clearly intimidated by Sarah's proximity and intensity. They all thought they were untouchable until they met someone who didn't care about their threats. "You just threatened my family's livelihood because you don't want your daughter to face consequences for her actions. That was a mistake." She straightened up, giving Pierce some breathing room but keeping her eyes locked on his. "Here's what's going to happen. Madison is going to be suspended for the remainder of the semester. She's going to publicly apologize to Emma for her behavior, and she's going to receive whatever counseling or treatment is necessary to ensure this never happens again. If you attempt to retaliate against my family in any way, I will make it my personal mission to expose every questionable business practice, every bought influence, and every covered-up incident in your family's history." Pierce's face flushed red with anger. "You can't threaten me. Do you know who I am?" Sarah smiled, and it was genuinely frightening. "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Pierce. You're a small-town bully who's gotten used to pushing people around because nobody has ever stood up to you. But I'm not from your small town, and I don't care about your local influence. I care about protecting my sister, and I'm very good at protecting the people I care about." The standoff stretched for several seconds before Davidson, clearly desperate to de-escalate the situation, cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should focus on finding a solution that works for everyone." "The solution is simple," Sarah replied, never taking her eyes off Pierce. "Madison faces consequences for her actions, and it never happens again. Everything else is just details." Pierce looked like he wanted to argue further, but something in Sarah's expression convinced him that would be a very bad idea. "Fine," he said finally, "but I want it on record that I think this is a gross overreaction to typical teenage behavior. Assault and criminal harassment are not typical teenage behavior, and if you believe they are, that explains a lot about how your daughter developed her current problems." The confrontation in Principal Davidson's office was just the beginning of what Sarah had planned for Madison Pierce. After securing Madison's suspension and a promise of administrative action, Sarah left the school with a sense of satisfaction, but she knew the real work was just beginning. Madison needed to understand not just that her behavior had consequences, but that those consequences would be severe and lasting if she ever targeted Emma again. Sarah's next stop was the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department, a small but well-maintained building on Main Street that served as the law enforcement hub for the rural community. Sheriff Tom Bradley was a 30-year veteran of local law enforcement who had earned his position through competence rather than politics. Sarah had done her research on him too, and she knew he was someone who took his responsibilities seriously. The sheriff was a large man with graying hair and the weathered complexion of someone who spent time outdoors. He looked up from his paperwork when Sarah entered his office, and she could see him automatically cataloging details about her appearance and demeanor with the practiced eye of an experienced law enforcement officer. "Sheriff Bradley, I'm Commander Sarah Henderson, United States Navy. I need to file a report regarding assault and harassment charges against a minor. Bradley gestured to a chair across from his desk. Please, sit down, Commander. What can you tell me about the situation? Sarah presented the same evidence she had shown to Principal Davidson: the threatening messages, Emma's written account of the harassment, photographs of her injuries, and the voicemail recording. Bradley listened without interruption, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. This is serious stuff, he said finally. The physical assault alone is enough for charges, but these threats about harming your family's business interests, that elevates this to a whole different level. I'm glad you understand the severity of the situation, Sarah replied. What I need to know is what you're prepared to do about it. Bradley leaned back in his chair, considering his options. Well, the Pierce girl is a minor, so we'd be looking at juvenile proceedings, but given the pattern of behavior and the sophistication of the threats, I think we can make a case for trying her as an adult on some of the charges. What about her accomplices? If we can prove they participated in the harassment or were present during the assault, they'd face charges too. But I have to warn you, Commander, the Pierce family has significant influence in this community. They're likely to hire expensive lawyers and fight this every step of the way. Sarah smiled grimly. Let them. I have resources they don't know about, and I'm not going anywhere until this is resolved properly. As if summoned by their conversation, the door to Bradley's office burst open and Richard Pierce stormed in, his face red with anger, and his expensive suit slightly rumpled from his obvious haste to get there. Tom, what's this nonsense about pressing charges against my daughter? He demanded, completely ignoring Sarah's presence. You know as well as I do that kids get into scrapes sometimes. This is just vindictive harassment by people who want to take advantage of our family's success. Sheriff Bradley's expression hardened at Pierce's presumptuous entry and demanding tone. Richard, you need to calm down and show some respect for proper procedures. And you might want to acknowledge Commander Henderson, who is the complainant in this case. Pierce turned to look at Sarah, his expression a mixture of anger and calculation. Commander, I thought we had reached an understanding at the school. Madison will be appropriately disciplined through academic channels. There's no need to involve law enforcement in what amounts to a teenage disagreement. Sarah stood slowly, using her height and military bearing to maximum advantage. Mr. Pierce, your daughter committed assault and battery against my sister. She then engaged in a campaign of criminal harassment that included threats against my family's livelihood. Those are felony charges, not teenage disagreements. You're blowing this completely out of proportion. Madison is a good kid who made some poor choices. She doesn't deserve to have her entire future ruined over a momentary lapse of judgment. A momentary lapse of judgment. Sarah's voice was dangerously quiet. Your daughter has been terrorizing my sister for months. She broke Emma's wrist and then threatened to destroy our family if Emma told anyone the truth. That's not a momentary lapse of judgment. That's the behavior of a predator. Sheriff Bradley intervened before the confrontation could escalate further. Richard, I suggest you contact your attorney and have Madison report here with appropriate legal representation by tomorrow morning. Commander Henderson has presented compelling evidence of criminal behavior, and I intend to investigate fully. Pierce's face cycled through several emotions before settling on cold anger. You're making a mistake, Tom, both of you. This community has a long memory, and people don't forget when outsiders come in and try to destroy local families. Sarah stepped forward, closing the distance between her and Pierce until she was well within his personal space. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had faced down genuine threats in genuinely dangerous places. Mr. Pierce, I want you to understand something very clearly. I am not an outsider trying to destroy your family. I am a United States Navy commander whose sister was assaulted by your daughter. If you continue to frame this as anything other than what it is, criminal behavior that must have consequences, then you're going to discover just how much damage a trained military operative can do to your reputation, your business, and your family's standing in this community. The threat was delivered with such calm precision that Pierce actually took a step backward. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm explaining reality to you," Sarah replied. "Your daughter made the choice to target someone who couldn't fight back. You made the choice to try to cover it up and threaten my family with financial retaliation. Those were both mistakes, and mistakes have consequences."
Pierce looked to Sheriff Bradley for support, but found none. The sheriff's expression made it clear that he was taking the charges seriously and wouldn't be swayed by political pressure. "I'll be in touch with my attorney," Pierce said finally, his bluster replaced by wary calculation. "You do that," Sarah replied, "and make sure your attorney explains to Madison that her best option at this point is to cooperate fully and accept responsibility for her actions. Because if this goes to trial, I will make sure that every detail of her behavior becomes a matter of public record." After Pierce left, Sheriff Bradley looked at Sarah with something approaching admiration. "I have to say, Commander, you handle yourself pretty well in confrontational situations." "I've had practice," Sarah replied dryly. "What happens next?" "I'll formally open an investigation and issue a summons for Madison to appear with her parents and legal representation. Given the evidence you've provided, I expect we'll be filing charges within a few days. But I have to warn you, this is likely to get ugly before it gets better." "I'm counting on it," Sarah said. "Sometimes ugly is exactly what's needed to solve a problem permanently." The next phase of Sarah's plan took her to the Millbrook Gazette, the local newspaper that had been covering community news for over a century. The editor, Janet Morrison, was a woman in her 60s who had built a reputation for fair but thorough reporting. Sarah had researched her background and knew that Morrison had won several state journalism awards for investigative pieces that had exposed corruption in local government. "Commander Henderson," Morrison said, rising from her desk when Sarah entered the newspaper's small office. "I heard you were back in town. What can I do for you?" Sarah outlined the situation with the same methodical precision she had used with Principal Davidson and Sheriff Bradley. Morrison listened intently, taking notes and asking the kind of probing questions that indicated a sharp journalistic mind. "This is certainly newsworthy," Morrison said when Sarah finished. "The Pierce family's influence in this community makes any serious allegations against them significant. But I have to ask, what's your goal in bringing this to the media?" "Accountability," Sarah replied simply. "Madison Pierce has been enabled by a system that prioritizes her family status over the safety of other students. I want to make sure that system understands there are consequences for that kind of enabling behavior." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "I'll need to verify the facts independently, of course, but if everything checks out, this could be front-page material. Are you prepared for the kind of attention that will bring?" "I'm prepared for whatever it takes to protect my sister and prevent this from happening to other students. Madison Pierce is a predator who has been allowed to operate without consequences for too long. That ends now." The interview took another hour, with Morrison asking detailed questions about Emma's experiences, the school's response, and the evidence Sarah had gathered. When it was over, Morrison had enough material for a comprehensive story that would shine an uncomfortable spotlight on the entire situation. "When will this run?" Sarah asked as she prepared to leave. "Tomorrow's edition. And, Commander, I want you to know that I think you're doing the right thing. Too often, people in positions of power use their influence to protect their children from the consequences of bad behavior. It takes courage to stand up to that kind of pressure." Sarah's final stop of the day was the most important one. She drove to the address she had found for Madison Pierce's family home, a sprawling colonial mansion on the most exclusive street in Millbrook. The house sat on several manicured acres, with a circular driveway, professional landscaping, and the kind of ostentatious displays of wealth that were meant to impress and intimidate visitors.
Sarah parked her rental car directly in front of the main entrance and walked to the front door with the confident stride of someone who had every right to be there. She pressed the doorbell and waited, knowing that this conversation would determine whether Madison Pierce truly understood the new reality of her situation. The door was answered by Madison herself, a 17-year-old girl who looked exactly like Sarah had expected. Perfectly styled blonde hair, expensive clothes, and the kind of entitled expression that came from never being told no in any meaningful way. Madison's confidence faltered slightly when she saw Sarah, but she recovered quickly. "Can I help you?" Madison asked, her tone carrying just enough rudeness to make her attitude clear. "Madison Pierce. I'm Sarah Henderson, Emma's sister. I think we need to have a conversation." Madison's expression shifted from confusion to calculation to barely concealed fear as she realized who was standing on her doorstep. "I don't have to talk to you," she said, starting to close the door. "Actually, you do, because the alternative is that we have this conversation in front of a judge and jury with newspaper reporters taking notes."
Madison stared at Sarah for a long moment, clearly trying to decide whether defiance or cooperation was the smarter choice. Finally, she stepped back and allowed Sarah to enter the house. The interior of the Pierce home was exactly what Sarah had expected. Expensive furniture, original artwork, and the kind of decorator-perfect aesthetic that prioritized appearance over comfort. Madison led her to a formal living room and perched on the edge of an antique chair, her body language defensive but alert. "What do you want?" Madison asked, trying to project confidence she clearly didn't feel. Sarah remained standing, using her height advantage and the psychological pressure of looking down at Madison to establish control of the conversation. "I want you to understand exactly how much trouble you're in and exactly what's going to happen next if you don't start making better choices." She pulled out her phone and played the same threatening voicemail that had been so effective with Principal Davidson, Sheriff Bradley, and Richard Pierce. Madison's face went pale as she heard her own voice describing the harm she would bring to Emma's family. "That recording," Sarah continued, "along with all the text messages you sent, Emma's written testimony, and photographic evidence of her injuries has been provided to law enforcement, school administrators, and the local newspaper. By tomorrow morning, everyone in Millbrook will know exactly what kind of person you really are." Madison's composure cracked completely. "You can't do that. You'll ruin my life. I'm supposed to graduate in 6 months, and I have college applications pending." "You should have thought about that before you decided to terrorize my sister," Sarah interrupted coldly. "Emma is 17 years old, just like you. She should be worried about homework and prom dates, not whether she's safe in her own school. Instead, you made her afraid to leave her house." Tears started streaming down Madison's face, but Sarah felt no sympathy. She had seen too many genuine victims to be moved by the crocodile tears of someone who was only upset because they'd finally been caught. "Please, I know I made mistakes, but I didn't mean for things to go so far. Can't we work something out? My family has money. We could help pay for Emma's medical bills or something." Sarah's expression hardened further. "You think this is about money? You broke my sister's wrist and then threatened to destroy my family's livelihood if she told anyone the truth. You think you can buy your way out of that?" I was just angry. Emma always acted like she was better than everyone else, with her perfect grades and her stupid books. It wasn't fair that someone like her got all the attention from teachers when people like me worked so much harder." The entitlement in that statement was breathtaking, even to Sarah, who had dealt with some genuinely narcissistic individuals during her military career. Madison genuinely believed that Emma deserved to be victimized simply because she was intelligent and hardworking. "Madison," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more threatening than shouting would have been, "I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you.
You targeted my sister because you thought she was weak and defenseless. You thought her family had no power or influence to protect her. You were wrong on both counts." Sarah moved closer, forcing Madison to look up at her. "I am someone who has spent the last 12 years learning how to neutralize threats to innocent people. I have resources, training, and connections that your family can't even begin to understand. If you ever, and I mean ever, make any kind of contact with my sister again, if you so much as look at her wrong when she returns to school, I will make it my personal mission to ensure that the rest of your life is far more difficult than anything you put Emma through." Madison was crying too hard to respond, but Sarah wasn't finished. "Your father thinks his local influence makes your family untouchable. Your mother thinks her old money and social connections provide some kind of protection. They're both wrong. I don't care about your family's status in Millbrook, and I don't care about the consequences of standing up to local bullies. All I care about is making sure that Emma can live her life without fear, and that no other student ever has to go through what you put her through." Sarah straightened up and looked down at the sobbing teenager with cold satisfaction. "You made a choice when you decided to target someone you thought couldn't fight back. Now you get to live with the consequences of that choice. And Madison, the consequences are just getting started."
The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of her phone buzzing with calls and text messages. The Millbrook Gazette's front-page story had hit the community like a bombshell, and the reverberations were already being felt throughout the small town. Janet Morrison had done her job well, presenting the facts with professional objectivity while making it clear that serious crimes had been committed and covered up. Emma came downstairs looking better than she had in weeks. The knowledge that someone was finally taking her situation seriously had lifted a weight from her shoulders that had been crushing her spirit for months. She sat at the kitchen table with Sarah and Martha, reading the newspaper article with a mixture of vindication and nervousness. "Is this really going to work?" Emma asked, looking up from the paper. "Won't Madison's family just find some way to make this all go away?" "They can try," Sarah replied, sipping her coffee. "But the story is out now, and Sheriff Bradley is treating this as a criminal matter. It's much harder to make criminal charges disappear when there's public scrutiny involved." Martha squeezed Emma's hand across the table. "I'm so sorry you felt like you couldn't tell us what was happening. We should have seen the signs, should have done more to help you." "It wasn't your fault, Mom," Emma said. "Madison made it clear that telling anyone would just make things worse for our family. I was trying to protect you." "That's not your job," Sarah said firmly. "Protecting this family is my job, and I'm very good at my job." The phone rang, interrupting their breakfast. Martha answered it, and from her expression, Sarah could tell it wasn't good news. "That was Principal Davidson," Martha said after hanging up. "He wants to meet with us this morning to discuss Emma's return to school. Apparently there have been some developments." An hour later, Sarah, Emma, and Martha sat in Principal Davidson's office, which seemed somehow smaller and shabbier than it had the day before. Davidson looked like he hadn't slept, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested the phone had been ringing at his house all night. "I want to start by saying that the school district is taking this situation very seriously," Davidson began, his voice carefully neutral. "We've completed our preliminary investigation, and we will be implementing new anti-bullying policies effective immediately." "What about Madison Pierce?" "Miss Pierce has been suspended indefinitely, pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. Her academic work will be handled through independent study, and she will not be allowed on school property until further notice." "And her accomplices?" Davidson shifted uncomfortably. "Jessica Martinez, Brittany Wong, and Chloe Stevens have all been suspended for 5 days each. They will also be required to attend counseling sessions and complete community service hours focused on anti-bullying education." Sarah nodded approvingly. "That's a good start. What assurances can you give us that Emma will be safe when she returns to school?"
We're implementing a buddy system for students who have been victims of harassment. Emma will be paired with a student mentor who will help ensure she feels supported and protected. We're also increasing supervision in hallways and common areas, and we're establishing a confidential reporting system for future incidents. Emma spoke up for the first time since entering the office. What about the other students? Madison had a lot of friends who might blame me for getting her in trouble. It was a legitimate concern, and Emma was proud of Emma for thinking strategically about potential complications. We'll be addressing that through school-wide assemblies about bullying and its consequences, Davidson replied. We want to make it clear that victims of harassment will be protected, not blamed. The meeting lasted another 30 minutes, with Sarah asking detailed questions about specific policies and procedures. She wanted to make sure that Emma's return to school would be as safe and smooth as possible, but she also wanted to ensure that other potential victims would be protected in the future. When they left the school, Sarah felt satisfied with the administrative response, but she knew the real test would come when Emma actually returned to classes. Bullies like Madison Pierce often had loyal followers who might seek revenge on her behalf, and Sarah wanted to make sure Emma was prepared for that possibility. Their next stop was the Sheriff's Department, where they met with Sheriff Bradley to discuss the ongoing criminal investigation. Bradley had news that was both encouraging and concerning. We've made significant progress on the case, he reported. Madison Pierce and her parents met with their attorney yesterday afternoon, and they're indicating a willingness to negotiate a plea agreement. That's the good news. What's the bad news? The bad news is that Richard Pierce has been making calls to his political contacts, trying to pressure me to drop the charges or reduce them to minor infractions. He's also been spreading rumors that this is all a vindictive attack by an outsider who wants to damage a prominent local family. Sarah's expression hardened. Is the pressure working?
Not on me, Bradley said firmly. I've been doing this job for 30 years and I don't cave to political pressure. But Pierce has connections at the county and state level that could make things complicated. What kind of complications? The county prosecutor is an elected position, and Pierce's family has contributed significantly to various political campaigns over the years. There's a chance that prosecutor might decide the charges are too aggressive for what amounts to a teenage altercation. Sarah leaned forward in her chair. Sheriff Bradley, I want to be very clear about something. If Madison Pierce gets away with a slap on the wrist because of her family's political connections, it will send a message to every bully in this school district that they can act with impunity as long as their parents have enough money and influence. I understand your concerns, Commander, and I share them, but I can only investigate and arrest. What happens in the courtroom is up to prosecutors and judges. Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. Do you mind if I make a call? Bradley looked curious but nodded his consent. Sarah dialed a number and waited for the connection. Senator Morrison's office, this is David speaking. David, this is Commander Sarah Henderson. Is the senator available for a brief conversation? I have a constituent issue that requires immediate attention. There was a pause while David checked the senator's schedule. He can spare 5 minutes, Commander. Hold, please. Sarah put the call on speaker so Bradley and Emma could hear the conversation. After a moment, a familiar voice came through the phone. Sarah, it's good to hear from you. How are you enjoying your leave? Senator Morrison, I'm calling about a criminal matter in Millbrook County, Nebraska. A local family is trying to use political influence to obstruct justice in a case involving assault and criminal harassment of my minor sister. The senator's tone shifted to professional concern. Tell me more. Sarah provided a concise summary of the situation, including the evidence they'd gathered and the attempts by the Pierce family to use political pressure to avoid consequences. I see, the senator said when she finished, and you're concerned that local prosecutors might be susceptible to this pressure. That's correct, sir. I need to know that this case will be handled fairly, without regard to the defendant's family connections. Leave it with me, Sarah. I'll make some calls to ensure that the appropriate people understand the importance of handling this matter properly. No child should have to endure what your sister went through, regardless of who their family is or how much money they have. After ending the call, Sheriff Bradley looked at Sarah with undisguised respect. Senator Morrison is your contact in Washington? He chaired the committee that oversees naval special operations funding. We've worked together on several classified matters over the years. He's someone who understands the importance of protecting innocent people from predators. Emma reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I never thought anyone would take this seriously enough to fight for me like this." "Emma, I'm your sister. I would fight the entire world if that's what it took to protect you." The conversation was interrupted by Sheriff Bradley's radio crackling to life. After listening to the message, he looked up with an expression of grim satisfaction. "That was my deputy. Madison Pierce just turned herself in with her attorney. Apparently, they've decided to cooperate fully with the investigation in hopes of negotiating a reduced sentence." Sarah smiled coldly. Fear is a wonderful motivator. The meeting at the sheriff's department was followed by lunch at Henderson's Diner, a local restaurant that had been serving comfort food to Millbrook residents for over 50 years. Sarah had deliberately chosen a public venue because she wanted to gauge the community's reaction to the morning's developments. The response was mixed, but generally supportive. Several customers approached their table to express support for Emma and praise for Sarah's handling of the situation. Mrs. Patterson, Emma's former teacher, stopped by to say she was proud of them for finally standing up to her tormentors. But there were also disapproving glances and whispered conversations that suggested not everyone in Millbrook was happy about the Pierce family being held accountable for Madison's behavior. Sarah noted the faces of those who seemed less than supportive, filing the information away in case it became relevant later.
After lunch, they drove home to find Robert Henderson waiting on the front porch with a troubled expression. He'd been in town that morning, and he'd heard about the newspaper article and the criminal charges from several different sources. "Sarah," he said as they got out of the car, "we need to talk." They gathered in the living room, where Robert's concerns became immediately apparent. "I'm proud of you for standing up for Emma," he began, "but I'm worried about the long-term consequences for our family. The Pierces have a lot of influence in this county, and we still have to live here after you go back to the Navy." It was a legitimate concern, and Sarah understood her father's perspective. The Henderson family had built their life in Millbrook over 4 generations, and they couldn't simply leave if the situation became untenable. "Dad," Sarah said gently, "I understand your concerns, but we can't let fear of retaliation prevent us from doing what's right. Madison Pierce assaulted Emma and threatened our family. If we don't stand up to that kind of behavior, it will only get worse." "But what if they try to call in our loans or find ways to hurt the farm?" Robert asked. "We've worked our entire lives to build something here." Martha reached over and took her husband's hand. "Robert, our daughter was hurt and threatened. We can't let that stand, regardless of the consequences." Robert sighed deeply, the weight of the situation evident on his weathered face. "It's just hard to stand up to people who have so much power in this community. They only have power if we give it to them. And I promise you, Dad, I won't let anything happen to our family because we did the right thing." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Sarah opened it to find Janet Morrison, the newspaper editor, standing on the porch with a photographer and a notebook. "Commander Henderson, I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to follow up on this morning's story. There have been some interesting developments, and I think our readers deserve to know the full scope of what's happening." Sarah invited Morrison inside, curious about what new information she might have uncovered. "I've been getting calls all morning," Morrison explained, settling into the living room with her notebook. "It seems your sister's situation wasn't isolated. 3 other families have contacted me with similar stories about Madison Pierce and her group of followers." Emma looked shocked. "Other kids went through the same thing I did?" "Similar harassment, though apparently none as severe as what happened to you. But the pattern is clear. Madison Pierce has been targeting vulnerable students for at least 2 years, using her family's influence to avoid consequences."
Sarah felt a cold rage building in her chest. Madison hadn't just targeted Emma on a whim. She was a repeat offender who had been allowed to continue her predatory behavior because no one had been willing or able to stand up to her family's influence.
The revelation that Madison Pierce had been systematically targeting multiple students changed the entire dynamic of the situation. What had begun as Sarah's personal mission to protect her sister had evolved into something much larger, a reckoning with a pattern of abuse that had been allowed to fester in Millbrook's school system for years. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon coordinating with Janet Morrison to interview the other families who had come forward. The stories they told were remarkably similar to Emma's experience. Madison would identify vulnerable students, usually those from modest backgrounds who lacked social connections, and then systematically destroy their sense of safety and belonging at school. The first family Sarah met with were the Garcias, whose 16-year-old daughter Maria had been targeted the previous year. Maria was a quiet girl who excelled in mathematics and had dreams of becoming an engineer. Madison had focused her campaign of harassment on Maria's family's immigration status, spreading rumors and making threats that had ultimately forced the girl to transfer to a school in the next county. "We never reported it because we were afraid," Mrs. Garcia explained through tears. "Madison said her family could have us deported, even though we're legal residents. We couldn't risk it." The second family was even more heartbreaking. 14-year-old David Chen had been targeted because of his small stature and interest in art rather than sports. Madison and her followers had made his life so miserable that he had attempted suicide the previous spring. His parents had pulled him out of school entirely and were homeschooling him while he received intensive therapy. "We thought we were protecting him by keeping quiet," Mr. Chen said, his voice heavy with regret. "We thought if we just removed him from the situation, it would be enough. But seeing what happened to Emma made us realize that staying silent just allows it to continue." Each story added another layer to Sarah's understanding of Madison Pierce's predatory behavior. This wasn't teenage drama or normal social conflict. It was systematic abuse carried out by someone who understood exactly how to identify vulnerable targets and exploit their weaknesses. By evening, Sarah had compiled a comprehensive dossier that painted a picture of sustained criminal behavior spanning at least 2 years. She had witness statements, documentation of threats, and evidence of a pattern that extended far beyond what had happened to Emma. When she presented this information to Sheriff Bradley the following morning, his expression grew increasingly grim as he reviewed each case. "This changes everything," he said finally. "We're not looking at an isolated incident anymore. We're looking at a serial pattern of abuse that demonstrates premeditation and sophisticated planning." "What does that mean in legal terms?" asked Sarah. "It means Madison Pierce can be charged as an adult for multiple felonies: assault, criminal harassment, terroristic threats, conspiracy. We're talking about serious prison time, not juvenile detention." Sarah felt a fierce satisfaction at the news. Madison had operated for years under the assumption that her family's influence would protect her from consequences. She was about to learn that there were some lines that money and political connections couldn't uncross. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Walsh clearly struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't be legally damaging. That information is confidential and protected by student privacy laws," she said finally. "Actually," Sheriff Bradley said, standing up from his seat near the back of the auditorium, "that information is now part of an ongoing criminal investigation, and I can tell you that we've found evidence of at least 6 formal complaints that were filed and ignored over the past 18 months. The revelation sent a wave of angry murmurs through the crowd. Parents who had trusted the school system to protect their children were learning that their trust had been systematically betrayed. Emma stood up beside Sarah, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "I want everyone to know that I'm not asking for revenge or trying to destroy anyone's life. I just want to feel safe in school, and I want other kids to know that they don't have to suffer in silence the way I did." Her words were simple but powerful, and they seemed to crystallize the purpose of the gathering. This wasn't about punishment or retribution. It was about creating a school environment where all students could learn without fear. The meeting continued for another hour, with various parents sharing their own concerns about bullying and school safety. By the time it ended, the school board had committed to implementing comprehensive anti-bullying policies, increasing supervision and counseling resources, and conducting a thorough review of how previous complaints had been handled. As the crowd dispersed, several parents approached Sarah and Emma to express their gratitude and support. Mrs. Patterson, Emma's former teacher, hugged both sisters with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry this happened to you, Emma, and thank you, Commander Henderson, for having the courage to fight for what's right." The outpouring of community support was gratifying, but Sarah knew the real battle was still ahead. Madison Pierce's family wouldn't give up easily, and they still had resources and connections that could complicate the legal proceedings. Her concerns proved justified the next morning when she received a call from the Sheriff Bradley office asking her to come to his office immediately. When she arrived, she found him pacing behind his desk with an expression of barely controlled anger. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. "I got a call from the county prosecutor's office this morning. They're declining to file charges against Madison Pierce." Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. On what grounds? They claim insufficient evidence for the more serious charges and argue that the remaining allegations amount to teenage conflicts that are better handled through the school system. "That's ridiculous," Sarah said, her voice dangerously quiet. "We have documented evidence of assault, criminal threats, and systematic harassment of multiple victims." "I know," Bradley replied, "and I told them exactly that. But the prosecutor is an elected official, and apparently he's decided that taking on the Pierce family isn't worth the political risk." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her mind racing through the implications and options. She had anticipated that the Pierce family might try to use their influence to escape justice, but she had underestimated their reach into the county prosecutor's office. "Sheriff Bradley, do you believe Madison Pierce committed crimes that warrant prosecution?" "Absolutely. If this case involved any other family in the county, charges would have been filed days ago." "Then we're not done fighting. I need you to forward all your evidence to the State Attorney General's office, and I also want you to request that the FBI investigate this as a potential civil rights violation." "The FBI? Do you think this case rises to that level?" Madison Pierce systematically targeted students based on their economic status, ethnicity, and perceived social vulnerabilities. That's textbook civil rights violation territory, and more importantly, the local prosecutor's refusal to file charges despite overwhelming evidence suggests a conspiracy to deny these students their civil rights. Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. "I'm also going to make some calls to Washington. This case is going to receive federal attention whether the Pierce family wants it or not." The first call was to Senator Morrison's office, where Sarah requested an urgent meeting to discuss federal intervention in a civil rights case. The second call was to a contact at the Department of Justice who specialized in cases involving the systematic denial of civil rights to minors. By the end of the day, Sarah had set in motion a series of events that would bring federal scrutiny to Millbrook County and force a reckoning with the corruption that had allowed Madison Pierce to operate with impunity. The Pierce family's attempt to use local political connections to escape justice had backfired spectacularly. Instead of making the problem go away, they had escalated it to a level where their local influence was meaningless. That evening, Sarah sat on the front porch with Emma, watching the sunset paint the wheat fields in shades of gold and amber. Emma seemed more relaxed than she had been in months, as if the knowledge that powerful allies were now fighting for her had lifted a weight off of her shoulders. "Do you think this will really work? Will Madison actually face consequences for what she did?" Sarah looked at her sister with absolute certainty. "Emma, I made you a promise that this would end, and I keep my promises. Madison Pierce and everyone who enabled her behavior are going to learn that there are consequences for targeting innocent people. It may take longer than we hoped, but justice will be served." "What happens if the federal investigation doesn't find anything?" Sarah smiled grimly. Then we moved to Plan B. What's Plan B? Civil court. Madison's family has money, which means they have assets that can be seized to compensate victims. If the criminal justice system fails us, we'll pursue financial justice instead. One way or another, Madison Pierce will face consequences for her actions. Emma leaned back in her chair, finally able to imagine a future where she could return to school without fear. Thank you, Sarah. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come home. You would have figured it out eventually, Sarah replied. You're stronger than you think, Em. You just needed someone to help you remember that strength. As they sat in comfortable silence, Sarah reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. When she had arrived in Millbrook, Emma had been a frightened victim trapped in a nightmare of systematic abuse. Now she was a survivor whose courage in speaking out had exposed a pattern of corruption and enabled justice for multiple victims. The battle wasn't over. Sarah knew that. Madison Pierce's family would continue to fight using every resource at their disposal. But the tide had turned, and Sarah was confident that right would ultimately prevail over might. Madison Pierce had made the mistake of targeting someone who had a protector with the skills, resources, and determination to fight back. Now she would learn that every choice has consequences, and some consequences can't be bought off or covered up. The small-town bully was about to discover what happened when she picked a fight with someone who never learned how to back down. The federal investigation began with a quiet efficiency that spoke to the seriousness with which the Department of Justice was treating the case. Within a week of Sarah's calls to Washington, a team of FBI agents and federal prosecutors had arrived in Millbrook to begin interviewing witnesses and reviewing evidence. The lead investigator was Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, a 20-year veteran of the Bureau who specialized in civil rights violations and public corruption cases. She met with Sarah at the Henderson farm on a crisp October morning, bringing with her the kind of professional competence that Sarah recognized from her own military service. "Commander Henderson," Walsh said as they sat at the kitchen table, "I want you to know that we're taking this case very seriously. The pattern of behavior you've documented, combined with the apparent failure of local authorities to respond appropriately, raises significant federal concerns." "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" Sarah asked. "These investigations typically take several months to complete thoroughly, but I can tell you that based on our preliminary review, we believe there's sufficient evidence to support federal charges against both Madison Pierce and potentially some of the officials who enabled her behavior." Emma, who had been listening quietly from across the table, looked up with hope in her eyes for the first time in months. "Does this mean she'll actually go to prison?" Agent Walsh nodded seriously. If convicted on federal charges, Madison Pierce could face significant prison time, yes. But more importantly, a federal conviction would create a permanent record that would follow her for the rest of her life. The investigation proceeded with methodical precision over the following weeks. Federal agents interviewed dozens of witnesses, including current and former students, teachers, and school administrators. They subpoenaed records from the school district, the Pierce family's businesses, and various local government offices. The scope of what they uncovered was staggering. Madison Pierce's campaign of harassment had affected far more students than initially realized, with some cases dating back to her freshman year. Even more damaging was the evidence of systematic cover-ups by school officials who had buried complaints to avoid confronting the Pierce family's influence. Principal Davidson was among the first to break under federal questioning. Faced with the possibility of criminal charges for civil rights violations, he provided detailed testimony about how complaints against Madison had been routinely dismissed or ignored on orders from the school board. "I knew it was wrong," he admitted during his recorded interview with federal agents. "But Richard Pierce made it clear that my job depended on keeping his daughter's problems quiet." He said the school district couldn't afford to lose his family's financial support. The revelation that Madison's behavior had been actively covered up by school officials transformed the case from a simple bullying incident into a conspiracy to deny students their civil rights. More importantly, it provided the federal leverage needed to bring serious charges against everyone involved.
Madison herself proved less cooperative when federal agents attempted to interview her. Accompanied by an expensive legal team hired by her parents, she invoked her Fifth Amendment rights and refused to answer any questions about her behavior toward other students. Her silence, however, was contradicted by the mountain of evidence that federal investigators had compiled. Text messages, social media posts, witness statements, and school records painted a clear picture of systematic abuse that had been protected by local corruption. The Pierce family's attempts to use their influence to derail the federal investigation proved spectacularly counterproductive. Richard Pierce's calls to various political contacts in Washington were not only ineffective, but actually drew additional attention to the case from congressional oversight committees. Senator Morrison, Sarah's contact in Washington, took particular interest in ensuring that the investigation proceeded without political interference. He used his position on the Senate Judiciary Committee to request regular briefings on the case's progress and to make it clear that any attempts to obstruct justice would face serious consequences. The pressure from federal authorities had an immediate impact on the local community. School board members who had previously dismissed complaints about bullying suddenly became eager to implement comprehensive reforms. The county prosecutor, who had refused to file charges against Madison, announced his intention not to seek re-election. Most importantly for Emma, the federal investigation created a safe space for her to return to school. With Madison suspended indefinitely and federal agents monitoring the situation, the harassment stopped completely. Emma's former tormentors were too frightened of federal scrutiny to risk any kind of retaliation. Emma's first day back at school was both nerve-wracking and triumphant. Sarah insisted on driving her to school personally, wanting to make sure that everyone understood she had powerful protection. "Are you ready for this?" Sarah asked as they pulled into the school parking lot.
Emma took a deep breath and nodded. "I think so. It feels strange not being afraid to walk through those doors. If anyone gives you any trouble, anyone at all, you call me immediately," Sarah instructed. "I'll be staying in town for another few weeks to make sure the transition goes smoothly." Emma's return to school was met with a mixture of curiosity, support, and carefully maintained distance. Many students who had previously been afraid to associate with Madison's targets now felt safe to offer friendship and support. Teachers who had been complicit in ignoring the harassment now went out of their way to ensure Emma felt welcome and protected. The transformation in the school's atmosphere was remarkable. Students who had previously accepted bullying as an inevitable part of school life now understood that there were real consequences for predatory behavior. Teachers and administrators who had turned a blind eye to harassment now took every complaint seriously. Mrs. Patterson, Emma's former teacher, approached her after class on her first day back. "Emma, I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "I saw what was happening to you, and I should have done more to help. I was afraid of getting involved, but that's no excuse." "It's okay, Mrs. Patterson," Emma replied, graciously. "The important thing is that it stopped, and other kids won't have to go through what I did." The federal investigation reached its climax in December when a grand jury returned indictments against Madison Pierce, 3 school board members, and Principal Davidson. The charges ranged from civil rights violations to conspiracy to obstruct justice, and they carried the potential for significant prison sentences. Madison was charged as an adult with multiple felonies, including assault, criminal harassment, and conspiracy to violate the civil rights of minority students. The federal prosecutors made it clear that they intended to seek maximum sentences to send a message about the seriousness of systematic harassment. The school officials were charged with conspiracy to violate civil rights and obstruction of justice for their roles in covering up Madison's behavior. Principal Davidson, faced with overwhelming evidence, agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence.
The indictments sent shockwaves through Millbrook's social establishment. The Pierce family, who had wielded unchallenged influence for decades, suddenly found themselves social pariahs facing financial ruin and potential prison sentences. Richard Pierce's car dealership began losing customers as news of the indictment spread. Victoria Pierce was forced to resign from her position on the zoning commission amid calls for a federal investigation into her own conduct. The family's carefully constructed empire of local influence began crumbling under the weight of federal scrutiny. Sarah watched these developments with satisfaction, but her primary focus remained on ensuring Emma's continued safety and recovery. The federal protection had eliminated the immediate threat, but Sarah knew that healing from systematic abuse took time and support. Emma had begun seeing a counselor who specialized in helping victims of bullying recover their confidence and sense of security. The sessions were helping, but Sarah could see that her sister was still carrying emotional scars that would take time to heal. "How are you feeling about everything?" Sarah asked one evening as they sat on the front porch, watching the winter sunset paint the snow-covered fields in shades of pink and gold. "Better," Emma replied honestly. "It's still hard to believe that it's really over. Sometimes I catch myself looking over my shoulder, expecting Madison to be there with some new threat." "That's normal," Sarah said gently. "Trauma doesn't disappear overnight, even when the source of the trauma is removed. But every day you go to school without being harassed, every day you feel safe in your own community, you're building new memories that will eventually outweigh the bad ones." Emma was quiet for a moment, contemplating her sister's words. "Do you think Madison will actually go to prison?" "Based on the evidence and the federal charges, I think it's very likely. But even if she doesn't, the federal conviction will follow her for the rest of her life. She'll never be able to escape the consequences of what she did." "I almost feel sorry for her," Emma said, surprising Sarah with her capacity for compassion. "She's only 17, and her whole life is ruined." Sarah looked at her sister with admiration. "Emma, the fact that you can feel compassion for someone who hurt you so badly shows how strong and good you really are. But remember, Madison made choices. She chose to hurt people who couldn't fight back. She chose to threaten innocent families. Those choices have consequences." "I know, and I know that if you hadn't come home when you did, she would have kept doing it to other people. Maybe it's better that she faces consequences now before she hurts even more people." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into their driveway. Sarah looked up to see Agent Walsh getting out of a government sedan, her expression suggesting she had important news. "Agent Walsh," Sarah said, rising to greet the federal investigator, "what brings you out here?" "I have some news about the case. Madison Pierce's attorneys approached us today with a plea bargain offer."
Emma leaned forward with interest. "What kind of offer?"
She's willing to plead guilty to the federal charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. She would serve 2 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. She would also be required to pay restitution to all her victims and perform community service focused on anti-bullying education. Sarah considered the offer carefully. "What's your recommendation?" "From a prosecution standpoint, it's a good deal," Walsh replied. "It guarantees a conviction and significant consequences without the uncertainty of a trial. It also ensures that Madison has a permanent federal record that will affect her for the rest of her life." "What about the other defendants?" Emma asked. "Principal Davidson has already agreed to plead guilty and testify against the school board members. The board members are likely to face trial unless they also agree to plea bargains." Sarah looked at Emma. "What do you think? You're the primary victim here, so your opinion matters most." Emma was quiet for several minutes, clearly wrestling with the decision. Finally, she looked up with the kind of mature wisdom that her experiences had forced her to develop. "I think we should accept the plea bargain.
Not because I forgive Madison for what she did, but because 2 years in federal prison and a permanent criminal record sends a strong message to other bullies. And honestly, I don't want to have to testify at a public trial and relive all of this." Agent Walsh nodded approvingly. "I think that's a wise decision, Emma. The plea agreement will achieve justice while allowing you to move forward with your life." As Agent Walsh left, Sarah felt a sense of closure that had been building for months. Madison Pierce would face serious consequences for her actions. The systematic corruption that had enabled her behavior had been exposed and dismantled, and Emma could finally begin to heal and move forward. The small-town bully who thought her family's money and influence made her untouchable had learned that there were some lines that couldn't be crossed without consequences. And Emma had learned that she didn't have to face her problems alone. Sometimes, having a big sister who knew how to fight made all the difference in the world. The plea hearing was scheduled for a gray January morning that seemed to match the somber nature of the proceedings. Sarah accompanied Emma to the federal courthouse in Omaha, where Madison Pierce would formally admit her guilt and accept the consequences of her actions. The courthouse was an imposing building of granite and glass that represented the power and authority of the federal government. As they walked through the metal detectors and security checkpoints, Emma squeezed Sarah's hand tightly, drawing strength from her sister's unwavering presence. The courtroom was smaller than Emma had expected, with polished wooden benches and the seal of the United States District Court prominently displayed behind the judge's bench. Several news reporters had gathered to cover the hearing, as the case had drawn statewide attention as an example of how federal authorities could intervene when local systems failed to protect vulnerable students. Madison entered the courtroom flanked by her expensive legal team, looking pale and subdued in a conservative dark suit. The confident, predatory teenager who had terrorized Emma for months had been replaced by a frightened young woman facing the reality of federal prison. Her parents sat in the front row behind the defense table, their faces etched with the kind of devastation that came from watching their carefully constructed world collapse. Richard Pierce's business empire was in ruins. His political connections had abandoned him, and his family faced financial ruin from legal fees and civil litigation. Judge Patricia Morrison, no relation to the senator who had helped bring federal attention to the case, was a stern woman in her 60s with a reputation for fairness and intolerance for predatory behavior toward children. "Miss Pierce," Judge Morrison said as Madison stood before the bench, "you are here today to enter a plea in response to federal charges of civil rights violations, assault, and conspiracy. Do you understand the charges against you?" "Yes, Your Honor," Madison replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "And how do you plead to these charges?" Madison looked back at her parents one last time before facing the judge. "Guilty, Your Honor." The simple word carried enormous weight, representing not just an admission of criminal behavior, but an acknowledgement that the systematic harassment of vulnerable students would not be tolerated by the federal government. Judge Morrison spent several minutes reviewing the details of the plea agreement, ensuring that Madison understood the full scope of the consequences she was accepting. 2 years in federal prison, 5 years of supervised probation, restitution to all victims, and a permanent felony record that would affect every aspect of her future life. "Miss Pierce," Judge Morrison said, finally, "before I accept this plea, I want you to understand that your actions caused real harm to real people. You systematically targeted vulnerable students, caused psychological trauma that will take years to heal, and created an atmosphere of fear that affected an entire school community." Madison nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand, Your Honor. Do you have anything you would like to say to your victims before sentencing?" Madison turned to face Emma, who sat in the gallery with Sarah. For a moment, the two teenagers looked at each other across the courtroom, victim and perpetrator finally confronting each other in a setting where Madison's family influence carried no weight. "I'm sorry," Madison said, her voice breaking. "I know that's not enough. And I know I can't undo the harm I caused, but I am truly sorry for what I did to you and the other students I hurt." Emma nodded silently, accepting the apology without offering forgiveness. Some actions went beyond what a simple apology could repair, but hearing Madison accept responsibility was an important step in Emma's healing process. Judge Morrison accepted the plea agreement and scheduled sentencing for the following month. As court officers led Madison away in handcuffs to begin her journey into the federal prison system, her parents watched with the hollow expressions of people who had lost everything that mattered to them. Outside the courthouse, Emma was approached by several news reporters who wanted to interview her about the case. With Sarah's support, she agreed to make a brief statement that she hoped would help other victims of bullying understand that they didn't have to suffer in silence. "I want other students to know that they don't have to accept harassment or abuse. There are people who will help you, who will fight for you, and who will make sure that bullies face consequences for their actions. You don't have to be afraid, and you don't have to face it alone." The statement was broadcast on local and state news programs, and Emma received dozens of letters from students around the state who had been inspired by her courage to speak out about their own experiences with bullying. The sentencing hearing a month later was attended by all of Madison's victims, who were given the opportunity to provide impact statements describing how her behavior had affected their lives. Maria Garcia spoke about the anxiety and depression that had forced her to transfer schools. David Chen's parents described their son's suicide attempt and ongoing struggles with post-traumatic stress. Emma's impact statement was the most powerful, delivered with a quiet strength that commanded the attention of everyone in the courtroom.
Madison Pierce didn't just break my wrist, Emma said. She broke my sense of safety, my confidence, and my faith in the adults who were supposed to protect me. She made me afraid to go to school, afraid to speak up, and afraid that my family would suffer if I told the truth about what was happening to me. She paused, looking directly at Madison, who sat with her head bowed at the defense table. "But she also taught me something important about myself," Emma continued. "She taught me that I'm stronger than I thought I was, that I have people who love me and will fight for me, and that standing up to bullies, even when it's scary, is the only way to stop them from hurting other people." Judge Morrison listened to all the impact statements before imposing the agreed-upon sentence. Madison Pierce would serve 2 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation, during which she would be required to perform community service and receive counseling. "Miss Pierce," the judge said, "I hope you use your time in prison to reflect on the harm you caused and to develop the empathy that will prevent you from ever engaging in this kind of behavior again. The victims in this case have shown remarkable courage and resilience, and they deserve to move forward with their lives without fear of further harassment." As Madison was led away to begin her prison sentence, Emma felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. The nightmare that had dominated her life for so many months was finally over, and she could begin to imagine a future free from fear and harassment. The civil litigation that followed the criminal proceedings resulted in substantial financial settlements for all of Madison's victims. The Pierce family was forced to sell their mansion and most of their business interests to pay the court-ordered restitution and civil damages. More importantly, the case had fundamentally changed how bullying was handled throughout the state. The Nebraska Department of Education implemented new mandatory reporting requirements for harassment incidents, and schools were required to have trained counselors and intervention specialists on staff. Emma used part of her settlement money to establish a scholarship fund for students who had been victims of bullying, providing financial support for counseling, tutoring, and other educational resources. She also became a spokesperson for anti-bullying initiatives, traveling to schools throughout the region to share her story and encourage other students to speak up about harassment. Sarah remained on leave for several additional months, wanting to ensure that Emma's transition back to normal life was successful. She helped her sister rebuild her confidence, supported her academic recovery, and gradually prepared her for the independence she would need when Sarah returned to active duty. "Are you sure you'll be okay when I go back to Virginia?" Sarah asked one evening as they worked together in Martha's vegetable garden, preparing for the spring planting season. "I'll be fine," Emma replied. And for the first time in over a year, Sarah believed her completely. "I know who I am now, and I know that I don't have to face problems alone.
If anything like this ever happens again, I know how to get help. And more importantly, Sarah added, the system is different now. The school has new policies, new leadership, and new accountability measures. What happened to you can't happen again, at least not without immediate consequences. Emma nodded, then looked up from the tomato seedling she was transplanting. Sarah, can you ask me something? Of course. Do you think Madison will be okay? I mean, after prison? Sarah considered the question carefully. Emma's capacity for compassion, even toward someone who hurt her so badly, continued to amaze her. I don't know, Sarah replied honestly. Prison is hard, especially for someone like Madison who's never faced real consequences before. But she's young, and people can change if they're willing to do the work. Maybe this experience will teach her empathy and help her become a better person. I hope so, Emma said quietly. I don't want her life to be ruined forever. I just wanted the harassment to stop. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. They looked up to see Sheriff Bradley getting out of his patrol car, his expression suggesting he had good news to share. Ladies, he said as he approached the garden, I wanted to let you know that the last of the school board members accepted plea bargains today. The federal investigation is officially complete. What kind of sentences did they get? Sarah asked. Probation and community service for the board members since they cooperated with the investigation. Davidson got 6 months in jail for his role in covering up the harassment. All of them are permanently barred from working in education. Emma stood up, brushing dirt from her hands. So it's really over? It's really over, Bradley confirmed. The federal prosecutors are satisfied that justice has been served and there are no outstanding charges or investigations related to the case.
As Bradley drove away, Sarah and Emma returned to their gardening, working together in comfortable silence as the sun set over the wheat fields. The nightmare that had brought Sarah home from her military service was finally, completely over. Emma could return to being a normal teenager, worried about homework and college applications instead of harassment and threats. Sarah could return to her naval career, confident that her sister was safe and protected by a reformed system that would never again allow predatory behavior to go unchecked. The small-town bully who had thought she was untouchable had learned that there were always consequences for those who preyed on the innocent. And Emma had learned that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined, with a support system that would never let her face her problems alone. Most importantly, the entire community had learned that money and influence couldn't protect those who chose to harm others. Justice might sometimes be delayed, but it was never denied to those who had the courage to fight for it.
6 months after Madison Pierce began serving her federal prison sentence, life in Millbrook had settled into a new rhythm defined by accountability, transparency, and genuine concern for student safety. The systematic changes that had been implemented in the wake of the federal investigation had transformed not just the school system, but the entire community's approach to protecting vulnerable young people. Emma had blossomed in the safe environment that these changes had created. Her grades had returned to their previous high standards, she had joined the debate team and the school newspaper, and she was making plans for college applications with a confidence that would have been impossible during the dark months of Madison's harassment. Sarah had finally returned to active duty, but she maintained regular contact with Emma and made sure to visit whenever her operational schedule allowed. The bond between the sisters had been strengthened by their shared experience of fighting for justice, and Emma now understood that she would never have to face any problem alone. On a warm spring morning, Emma was working in the school counseling office as a peer mentor when a shy freshman named Katie approached her with tears in her eyes. The girl reminded Emma so much of herself from a year ago, quiet, bookish, and clearly carrying the weight of something terrible that she was afraid to share. "Emma," Katie whispered,
glancing around to make sure no one else could hear. "I heard about what happened to you last year. I think something similar might be happening to me." Emma's heart clenched with familiar pain, but also with a fierce determination that had been forged in the crucible of her own experience. She gently guided Katie to a private corner of the counseling office and sat down beside her. "Tell me what's going on," Emma said softly, her voice carrying the kind of strength that came from surviving trauma and choosing to help others do the same. Katie's story was depressingly familiar. A group of older students had targeted her because of her family's financial struggles and her academic success. They had started with verbal harassment, but had recently escalated to pushing her in hallways and threatening her with worse if she told anyone what was happening. "I'm scared to tell my parents," Katie sobbed. "They're working so hard just to pay our bills, and I don't want them to worry about me too." Emma felt a surge of protective anger that reminded her of Sarah's reaction when she had first learned about Madison's behavior. But she also felt something else, a sense of purpose and power that came from knowing exactly how to help someone in Katie's situation. Emma said firmly, "you don't have to handle this alone, and you don't have to be afraid that telling adults will make things worse. The system is different now. There are people whose job it is to protect you, and they will take your situation seriously." Emma spent the next hour guiding Katie through the reporting process, explaining the new anti-bullying procedures that had been implemented in the wake of the federal investigation. She helped Katie document the incidents, identify witnesses, and prepare statements for both school administrators and law enforcement if necessary. Most importantly, she stayed with Katie when they reported the harassment to the new principal, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been hired specifically because of her expertise in creating safe school environments. Mrs. Rodriguez listened to Katie's story with the kind of serious attention that had been completely absent during Emma's own ordeal. "Katie," Mrs. Rodriguez said, after reviewing the documentation Emma had helped prepare, "I want you to know that this behavior will not be tolerated at our school. We're going to investigate this immediately, and we're going to make sure you feel safe here." Within hours, the students who had been harassing Katie were suspended pending a full investigation. Their parents were called in for meetings. Law enforcement was notified, as required by the new mandatory reporting procedures, and Katie was assigned a safety plan that ensured she would never be alone in areas where harassment might occur. The swift, decisive response was exactly what Emma had dreamed of during her own months of torment. The system that had failed her so completely had been rebuilt from the ground up, and it was working exactly as it should. That evening, Emma called Sarah to share the news about Katie's situation and how it had been handled. "I'm proud of you," Sarah said, and I could hear the emotion in her sister's voice. "You took your own pain and turned it into something that could help someone else. That's the mark of genuine strength." It felt good to be able to help. Katie was so scared and alone, just like I was, but she doesn't have to suffer for months the way I did. The system actually works now. "That's your legacy," Sarah said. "Every student who feels safe reporting harassment, every bully who faces immediate consequences, every victim who gets justice instead of being ignored, that's all because you found the courage to speak up and fight back." Emma was quiet for a moment, reflecting on how much her life had changed since that terrible day when Madison had broken her wrist and shattered her sense of security. The frightened, isolated girl who had hidden in her bedroom for weeks had become someone who could help other students navigate their own crises with confidence and hope. "Sarah," Emma said finally, "I've been thinking about what I want to study in college. I want to become a school counselor or maybe a social worker who helps kids in situations like mine. I want to make sure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else." "That sounds perfect," Sarah replied. "You've seen firsthand how the system can fail kids, and you've also seen how it can be fixed when people care enough to fight for change. You'd be an amazing advocate for students who need someone in their corner." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on Emma's bedroom door. Martha Henderson entered with a smile and an envelope in her hand. "Emma, this came for you today." She handed over an official-looking envelope with a return address from the Nebraska Department of Education.
Emma opened the envelope with curiosity and found herself holding a certificate recognizing her as the state's Student Advocate of the Year, along with a letter explaining that she had been selected for her courage in exposing systematic harassment and her ongoing work to help other students facing similar challenges. "They want me to speak at the state education conference this summer," Emma said, looking up from the letter with amazement. "They want me to share my story and talk about how schools can better protect students from bullying." Martha hugged her daughter tightly, her eyes filling with tears of pride. "Your father and I are so proud of the young woman you've become. You took something terrible that happened to you and found a way to help other people." As Emma prepared for bed that night, she stood at her bedroom window, looking out over the familiar wheat fields that stretched toward the horizon. The view was the same as it had been during those dark months when she had felt trapped and helpless, but everything else had changed. She was no longer the frightened victim who had been afraid to leave her house. She had become someone who could look bullies in the eye and help other students find their own strength. The support system that had saved her, Sarah's fierce protection, the federal investigation, the community's response, had been transformed into something that could help countless other young people. Madison Pierce was serving her federal prison sentence, learning firsthand that actions have consequences, and that money and influence couldn't protect those who chose to prey on the innocent. The school officials who had enabled her behavior were facing their own consequences, permanently barred from positions where they might again fail to protect vulnerable students. Most importantly, the system itself had been rebuilt with transparency, accountability, and genuine concern for student safety. What had happened to Emma could never happen again, at least not without immediate intervention and serious consequences for those responsible. Emma's phone buzzed with a text message from Katie. "Thank you for helping me today. I feel safe for the first time in weeks. I want to be like you someday, someone who helps other people when they're scared and alone." The message filled Emma with a sense of purpose and fulfillment that she had never experienced before. Her suffering had not been meaningless. It had created the catalyst for changes that would protect countless other students from similar experiences. She thought about Madison, alone in her federal prison cell, hopefully learning the empathy and remorse that her privileged upbringing had never taught her. Emma genuinely hoped that prison would help Madison become a better person, someone who understood that strength meant protecting others rather than victimizing them. She thought about Sarah, probably halfway around the world on some classified mission, carrying with her the satisfaction of knowing that she had successfully protected someone she loved and created lasting change in the process. Sarah had taught Emma that standing up to bullies wasn't just about personal courage. It was about recognizing that some fights were worth having because they protected not just yourself, but everyone who might face similar threats in the future. As Emma finally settled into bed, she felt a peace and contentment that would have been unimaginable during the darkest days of her ordeal. She had survived, she had fought back, and she had won not just justice for herself, but protection for every student who would walk the halls of Millbrook High School in the years to come. The small-town bully who thought she could terrorize innocent students with impunity had learned that there were always consequences for those who preyed on the defenseless. The corrupt officials who had enabled that behavior had discovered that their positions of authority came with responsibilities they couldn't ignore without facing federal prosecution. And Emma Henderson, the quiet farm girl who had once been afraid to speak up about her own victimization, had found her voice and used it to protect others who couldn't yet protect themselves. The wheat fields outside her window stretched endlessly toward the horizon, just as they had done for generations of Henderson family members who had learned to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. Emma had proven herself worthy of that legacy, and she looked forward to a future where her strength could serve as a shield for others who needed protection. Madison Pierce had picked the wrong farm girl's sister to mess with. But more than that, she had underestimated the power of ordinary people to fight extraordinary injustice when they found the courage to stand together and demand that bullies face the consequences of their actions. The nightmare was over, but the legacy of courage, justice, and protection would endure for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.